giants or the Nephilim that filled the land with violence before the flood, they are an important factor. They are a slot that is often called upon and used where it's going to be multiple stories. When we get to the flood part, all the elements that were present between chapter 1 and chapter 11, you should expect those elements to be drawn upon for the rest of the book of Genesis and on through the Torah. Shalom, shalom. Welcome back. Study the Bible Not the Sermon TV. I am Brother Nicodemus O. Smith, and this is Mehalak, also known as the Slow Genesis Walkthrough. Just a warning, we read bizarre stories. The video may be slightly longer than normal, and that's why. But also, dig around in the channel for other content connected to this video. And so, we on our third remix, the rendition of the song. By Genesis 14, the story begins telling us about what seems to be a random chain of events. Immediately, we told about a bunch of random kings in verse 1 and 2, and how they met up to make war in a random place in verse 3. Except none of this is random. First of all, the first king mentioned, king of Shinar. And Shinar is a place. We were just told about it in chapter 11, like last week. Shinar is a part of Babylon. So we got the king of Babylon and his comrades. It's almost like Babylon has followed Abraham to this place. Babylon, and then it say Elim, is Persia. Spoiler alert, Babylon and Persia are the nations that's going to remove Israel like a flood in what will become the promised land. I used to think this was here to tell us how Lot got taken and Abraham rescued him, but that's such an afterthought. So much attention is given to everybody's name and the country is repeated again. And they actually counted them out for us. That is 4 against 5. Now, because this is the flood, which is a flood of violence, it matters that all these Canaanite kings have names that are like terrible things to name your children. It is worth your time to look them up and meditate on them. Don't just take my word for it. Here, in verse 4, it says the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with some other kings, served the stronger group of kings for like 12 years. And then on the 13th year, the Bible said that they served them, and the 13th year they rebelled. Basically, the kings decided they wasn't paying the tribute this year. They didn't want to come off that bread. Probably bread, literally. And so when it was official, they wasn't going to pay the whole 13th year. When the 14th came around, Chedorlaomer and his Confederate allies, they decided to pull up. But before they pulled up, the narrator made sure we understood this is part of the remix. So the narrator continues at verse 5. And in the 14th year of Chedorlaomer, the kings that were with him and smote the Rephaims and Asheroth and Karnaim and the Zuzims and Ham and the Emims and Shaveh and Kerethaim. And so this qualifies as one of those weird stories, okay? Why are we given all of this detail if the point of this story is to explain what happened to Lot and why Abraham needed to go put in work? All of this detail about these kings, and it continues the rest of the verses. It talks about all these random places that aren't random, are places that Israel is going to wander to in the wilderness in the book of Exodus and in Numbers, but are random to be placed right here, right now, all of these details. However, upon closer analyzation of all these people, the kings attacked on their way to the war, they knocked off all these people on their way to the people that actually rebelled against them. Who are these people? The Rephaims and Asheroth. Definitely pagans, right? Asheroth is the queen mother, I believe, and the Emims and the Zuzims are the same people that Moses called giants in Deuteronomy 2. And that Moab called giants. All these places that's going to appear later in the story with all these people groups that also appear later, even the people in Asheroth. Asheroth received a lot of diss tracks from the prophets, just saying. All this symmetry and linkage backwards and forward is literally the reason why this playlist exists. Someone very obviously wants you to see connections here because the story is so weird without it. It's even kind of weird with it. But what else can you make of the fact that Abraham isn't even mentioned yet? Why should we care about any of this? Because all of these nations is going to show up later, as well as the places that all of these battles is happening. And all of this is inviting us to read stories next to each other. Put them in. Compare and contrast. And if you read on in the chapter, the flood of violence continues through all these random places, except that the place is not random. Mount Seir, the wilderness of Paran, Kadesh, all the places that Israel will wander into the wilderness. This is a flood of violence adjacent to the promised land and the nearby wilderness. So remember this thing that we're looking at this is like a stage play, and we are looking at different stories where different people fill the same slots of the play, but their play is rehearsed slightly different. But it's still clear enough where you can tell someone intentionally wants us to see that these stories are playing out according to the same type of theater play. Therefore, the giants or the Nephilim that filled the land with violence before the flood, they are an important factor. They are a slot that is often called upon and used where it's going to be multiple stories when we get to the flood part, which is Genesis 1 verse 2. Challenge accepted. Means that all the elements that were present between chapter 1 and chapter 11, you should expect those elements to be drawn upon for the rest of the book of Genesis and on through the Torah. Since Babylon is everything that is wrong with the world, then we won't be surprised if whenever there is a decreation moment, the giants show up, or something that reminds us of the giants, or something that should connect us to the giants. All right, and so king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah with their allies went to battle, and the names are all ran off again, and count them out for you this time as well. 4 verses 5. Whoever wrote Genesis 14 really wants us to know the names of these kings and how many there were. I wonder if it's meaningful that Melchizedek is going to be the 10th king. So anyway, they engaged the battle, and the king of Sodom was quickly turned around, and he fled, clearly wasn't paying attention to where he was running, fell into the slime pits. You know, the first time we talked about slime pits was Noah's flood. And when they made the ark, it had the slime in the pits. And then in the story of Babylon, scattering flood, where they decided to make the bricks using the slime in the pitch. And of course, into the future with Moses' flood, his mama gonna make a box with slime and pitch for him to go through the waters and come out the other side. A chosen remnant, right? That's Exodus 2. And notice how here verse 10 says that the remnant that escaped fled to the mountains. Because someone always gotta escape, right? Hashtag remnant. By the time we get to verse 11, this is a situation that technically has nothing to do with Abraham or his family. This battle is happening whether Abraham is there or not, obviously, because Abraham isn't there and it happened. But something weird happened in verse 11. We are told that they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and their victuals. Right now, we read Old English, so don't let the vocabulary get past you. They say they took the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and the food. Victuals are food. So these kings took food that should not have been taken. And you're supposed to say, Brother Odad, how can you be sure that that's a link back to the garden? Well, if you already read the story, then you know how it ends. Was that a decision that was good, or was it a decision that led to failure? Now, if you never read the story, then stick around. We're going to get to it. But if you're feeling me so far, don't forget to smash the like button and drop me a comment. So, they took all the stuff, and they took Abraham's brother's son. In verse 13, we told about a remnant, a refugee that came out and reported all of this to Abraham the Hebrew. And we were told that he did not dwell in Sodom, but he was in Mamre, which means to see, right? Abraham is near trees of seeing with his friend Eshcol, whose name means grape cluster, and Aner, whose name means donkey. All these allies with Abraham. Abraham had no idea because he's chilling in the garden, away from the flood, living in peace with the nations, with the Canaanites even. But once he got word, party's over. He gathered his 300 trained ninjas that lived in his own house. He got all his YNs together, and in verse 14 says he pursued them to the far north of what will become the land of Israel, which is where the tribe of Dan found his inheritance in the northern border. In verse 16, it tells us basically Abraham won. How do you explain the fact that the Mesopotamian kings came through, not only they knocked off these other kings, but on their way, they knocked off these great warrior giants, the same ones that spread violence and destruction through the land. They knocked them off. Confederation of kings who knocked off the Nephilim get knocked off by Abraham? And that's the end of the flood story, or the remix, or the replaying of that part of the theater play. If you're satisfied with Genesis 1 verse 2 being connected to Genesis 14, I appreciate your time. If you're interested in the rest of the chapter, in my thoughts, find part 2 that was published simultaneously with this video. Other than that, we up.